If I'm 80 years old and I'm inside my business, better darn well believe that somebody in that business, if not on a regular basis, is asking themselves a question, what happens when the old man dies? I can't focus on 100 KPIs. I need to focus on 3, or I need to focus on 5. And maybe that changes next quarter or next year, but these are the 3 I'm really working on right now because I've got to achieve these objectives. I've got to focus. They're not having the conversation with the key members around themselves to understand and reflect on what does this mean to other people. Right. And how do I take that into account on my decision making?
Welcome to the Unconventional Leadership Podcast, where we help you unlock your potential as a leader. Hey, can I ask you a favor? Can you please hit subscribe or follow on any platform that you're listening or watching this episode? Our goal is to connect with you, to bring additional value to you, to bring additional topics to you, and we can do that more effectively if you hit subscribe or follow. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the Unconventional Leadership Podcast. Today, you're in for a real treat. I have a longtime, dear, close friend of mine in the studio with me, who's an investment banker, a business executive, a business owner, and a strategist to many leaders like myself and others. So Brent Rippe, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
So you and I have dialogued for years about the power of thinking about long-term thinking for businesses. And
Absolutely.
You own companies, you invest in businesses, you help business owners and family owners and private companies think through long-term strategies. And we thought this would be a great episode to have a discussion with our listeners to learn about next level strategy, not the strategy to execute for today, but the strategy to execute for 3 to 5 years from now.
Amen. This is something we're very passionate about, and I'm excited for the conversation.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So share with me a moment in time, if there is one, where you were sitting with another business leader and you heard the same talk track where you realized there's got to be another way to think about the bigger picture and almost redefining the bigger picture for leadership teams. There had to have been a moment where you had this epiphany of like, we got to change this conversation.
Well, it was more iterative early in my career. I mean, I've been in this business for over 20 years, and there was a recurring theme that was coming out with a lot of the clients that we were working with. And they would hire us at the point of sale, and we'd go run really great processes and try to optimize for their outcomes. But it was this sense that, late in the process, in the 7th, 8th, or 9th inning of a process, right before they were selling the business, they were lamenting, that they hadn't quite known what they should have known. And had they known what they could have known, they would have changed a lot of variety of things around the transaction. And it was this sense that you work 30, 40, 50 years to build a business, putting in, the blood, sweat, and tears of what it takes to do that. All the risk, all the money, all the time away from the family. Sometimes it's multi-generational. So it's not only, my work, but it's my parents' work or my grandparents' work. And then you look at all the people around the organization that help build that. It's, the person that's been with you for 30 years and this team and this, everything that comes together to make a great business, a great business. Mm-hmm. And it was this feeling that, you're kind of not grasping a defeat from the jaws of a win, but it was, one of these things where it felt like, it just wasn't being optimized. Mm-hmm. And it was, some of this stuff was very predictable. Right at the outset, we would know, an engagement, we would know that there was going to be a perspective issue around a thing. And our job at that point, being hired at the time of sale, was how do we best position this for the conversation with the buyer set that we're ultimately going to have? And we just started saying, wouldn't it be great to start to fix some of these issues before we actually ended up with the mandate to actually sell the business?
And so that the optimization you were able to do looked very different if you got hired a year out versus, man, if we were able to actually work with leaders 5, 6, 7 years in advance, we could start changing their mindset and changing the way they think about their future, which would then build a totally different optimization subset.
Absolutely.
Right? Put them in a different level of expectation. Have you worked with companies longer than that? Have you ever been on the strategy team for longer than 5 years where you're helping a company and a leadership team navigate, whether it's one you've owned or one you've advised in?
Yeah. I think the longest tenured one from the advisory side has been probably in that 8 to 9 year time frame that we were working with the company as a part of their integrated team, all the way up into the point that they made the decision to actually pull the trigger on the sale.
Wow.
And if you looked at the early innings of the companies that we were working with, it was more organic. We were trying to look at it from the frame of like, okay, we're just going to be a general advisor to you and start to think alongside of you. I think as we've kind of come into an understanding of the impact that it can mean on an organization, we've started really trying to organize ourselves that how do we processize this, that, there's a playbook, if you will, where we can replicate the outcomes that we've seen be successful for the other clients that we've worked with. So, yeah.
What are a couple of the initial attributes where you see like, boy, there's an opportunity to approach this differently?
Yeah.
And then I believe you then start coaching the owner and the CEO. So what are the first things that you typically are like, Mike, these are just, or an audience, these are just low hanging fruits, things to think about in your business today?
So, I think there's always opportunity to add value and be thinking about the prospective transaction and starting to position for that prospective transaction before you make that decision. So I think that's ubiquitous of whatever type of business that you have or whatever size you are or whatever type of company is. The question for us is really, where do we get the most fruit? And where we're trying to focus our efforts are, initially we want to understand the coachability and the willingness to buy into the fundamental thesis that, if I do a little bit of pre-planning or if I do a lot of pre-planning, that I can get exceptionally different outcomes as a result of said pre-planning before I choose to go to the market. And some of the ways that we assess that at the outset is, okay, how do we understand where they're going and how engaged are they with the process and trying to discover that for themselves to really engage in that conversation. So the start of our process really starts with called a stakeholder alignment exercise, where we want initially at least the primary business owners to run through a process that helps them discover what does an ideal state look like. Eventually, if not at the outset, we want them to engage with tiers of stakeholders beyond them, secondary stakeholders who might be very important to a transaction for a buyer, but at the end of the day, don't have the decision-making authority to sell the business. So this could be like a non-owner president or a key salesperson that might have phantom shares. They can't make the decision to sell the business, but a buyer is going to look at them and say, if this person's not on board, I've really got an issue buying this business.
Right. And let me stop you. So with that, how is in a family business or a founder-led company, how important is it to think about removing yourself from those key seats so you have professional management in place versus, call it family or founder in place, being the head of sales or being the, we've seen some family business where the family is the head of HR, the VP of finance, the, director of sales are all family members.
Yeah.
How does that look to a potential transaction down the road?
So, look, I think you're always trying to mitigate risk. So to the degree that you are single-threaded in any position, whether it be an owner or a family member or be another member, that presents risk to a buyer. But, Mike, it really isn't about how do I create redundancy and remove myself from the business prior to selling the business. That could be an answer for a particular outcome that may be defined as something you want to achieve. But it really depends on what you want to achieve. So if you start with why, some business owners are saying, hey, I want to transition a part or all of my business because I don't want to be in the owner seat, or I feel like the business could be much more as a part of a larger organization, or I just want to cash out of my equity, but I don't want to retire. Right. And in those instances, it's not about how do I replace myself. It's about how do I integrate myself into the business and position myself as the potential visionary or leader of this organization to carry it forward on behalf of the buyer set that I'm otherwise trying to convince to acquire me. So it gets back to that stakeholder alignment, which is I've really got to get good at defining for myself what does good look like. And that goes a lot further beyond just pricing or timing. There's all these other soft factors, especially for private business owners or entrepreneurs, that they take into account and that they really need to start to think about how they define. Then there's understanding of the people around them that they really have to gather, not because those people have the decision-making authority in selling the business, but that they need to understand where there might be alignment or misalignment and how people are feeling and what are, and if I can start to map that and understand that, or it can be translated to an investment banker like myself. Now, all of a sudden, the investment banker can start to compare the existing fact set to that outcome and say, okay, your goal of the business is to sell the business and be on a Hawaiian island next year.
Man, that sounds great.
Right? Doesn't it?
But I'm not doing it because I'm in. I'm in for the long haul.
I'm with you. Trust me, I'm with you. But, I mean, if that's your fundamental goal, then the pursuit of the actions that you need to be starting to think about 2-3 years beforehand as to the importance of your role inside that organization grows to the top end of the list. I've got to start to figure out how I create redundancy around my decision making and delegate that, and that becomes a priority and a point of focus in positioning that business for what your outcome is.
And that's the other thing. The outcome, the only option is not to sell the business. There's lots of different outcomes.
That's right.
So I'll use my own example. So, purchasing a now 50-year strong executive search firm from my parents, one of the outcomes for my dad was transitioning to the next generation.
That's right.
And there was a point in time, I remember actually, where he and I, we went through the Gehring Center, and with the thought process of I didn't know at the time if this is what I wanted to spend the rest of my life doing.
Yeah.
So we went through it to evaluate that. His goal was at some point, I'm going to need to transition the company.
Yeah.
And he had an advisor ask him, where will you realize, Mike, in 10 years, you're going to be 62 years old.
Yeah.
And where do you want to be at 62? Right. And that triggered an event for him of like, oh, wow, I really need to be thinking about the future outcome for the organization. That ultimately led to us taking stakeholder feedback, which looked like close team and non-equity partners of my dad. We spent time with our clients.
Yeah.
So we spent time actually back to key stakeholders. These are the kind of key stakeholders you're talking about. We spent time meeting with some of our core clients to ask the question about what are their concerns, thoughts, and ideals or advice they would have for us as we transition, knowing that at the time he held some of those critical relationships to our organization.
Yeah.
So we spent a journey in that, getting feedback. That voice of the customer experience, the person we hired for this came back to us and said to our board of advisors at the time, non-family board of advisors, and to my dad and I, that one, your clients love you. They trust you, they believe in you, and you believe in them. And gosh, I can't say I've met with a consulting client's customers who are like, it's like they're deep friendships.
Yeah.
Like these are deep embedded friendships. And I always say, like, when you walk alongside of a CEO and an ownership team to help their family transition, help their business transition and go through succession, you get to know them pretty intimately, as do you with your clients.
Yeah.
And in that same conversation was, why do you guys refer so many strategy, coaching, organizational development ideas and needs of your clients to other companies? Why do you do that? Why don't you do that yourself? Because what it sounded like to her at the time, her name was Barb heard growth opportunity. So at the time, Centennial doing executive search, my dad would say that he was doing what we're doing with Talent Magnet Institute. He was just
He didn't organize
he didn't organize it. It wasn't structured.
Right.
And that really begot our board to say, I think there's another idea here.
Yeah.
And my dad's feedback was, that sounds exciting, but I'm not interested in doing that. So as a part of our long-term planning, it was establish executive search firm. How do we transition that? And I got excited about the other thing
Yep.
that could give me energy, which is then became a conversation with you in a 4-hour car ride from a leadership retreat back home of like, I think we're going to start something.
Yeah.
Right. So that's part of the strategy of, in my dad's case, of his exit.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't to sell the company to someone who doesn't know the organization. It was to work on a transition and a succession plan.
Amen.
And then what does it look like to do that? And how do we stabilize and innovate at the same time? There was a discussion years ago that was had at the Gehring Center. It was called intrapreneurship.
Mm-hmm.
And it really inspired me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm like, I've grown up in a family of entrepreneurs.
Mm-hmm.
Intrapreneurship, the way it was defined at that event, is inside of a entrepreneur organization, it's the next big idea.
Got it.
So you're driving a new vision out of, we call it the mothership,
Yeah.
right? The mother company of Centennial birthed Talent Magnet Institute. And now we've got 2 organizations running at the same time. And my dad is in Arizona as we speak, and snow's coming down here. He's enjoying the warmth of Arizona. He texted me this morning. It looks like I should stay for another week. That was one of his long-term plans. But that's kind of part of the options here.
Yeah.
So you see, yes, you could sell the organization. You could go ESOP. You could sell it to your employees. You could do a management buyout. You and I have a friend, Jim, that did a management buyout.
That's right.
Of a family business that he was with for 15 years. And then you also have just transitioning to a next generation. Happens in our case to be family. I remember there was also a scenario where I was sitting in a room with a business owner.
Yeah.
And he was talking to my dad about selling his business. It was in a like state industry.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember vividly sitting across from my dad and my dad going, I'd be right where you are to this other business owner
Mm-hmm.
if I didn't have him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right? My strategy is now to support him and helping our succession be successful.
Yeah.
If I didn't have him, I'd be right where you are.
Absolutely.
Taking a business to market.
Well, and I think, in some respect, your dad is a very thoughtful person. So as are you. That's a root of what your business is. And it's not trying to demean the entrepreneur, but what we find is that level of thought put behind the how I'm going to do this is oftentimes the exception rather than the rule. Mm-hmm. And it's the old adage that what we find is the entrepreneurs, the CEOs of these businesses are incredibly busy. They're being pulled in multiple different directions, or wearing a lot of hats. And they've got a lot of fires burning on their front doorstep. They've got to hire their next person. They got to find their next customer. They got to find their next supplier. They're constantly at an issue that is burning on their front doorstep.
Yeah.
And oftentimes they don't have a background in transactions.
Right.
So they don't understand how a transaction is going to happen. There's a lot of fear based around it. So, am I going to get what I want out of this? Or is somebody going to call my baby ugly? What's going to happen to my people? And what it ends up from a lot of these entrepreneurs being, I'm going to kick that conversation to tomorrow on a perpetual cycle.
Yeah.
So as a banker, we'll talk to some of those business owners, and they're saying, I'm on a 3 to 5 year time frame. And then you talk to them the next year and they're, I'm 3 to 5 years out. And then they're next year, they're 3 to 5 years out. And then all of a sudden they get, a diagnosis, or they get approached by an unsolicited buyer and they sell like that. It's like, wow, what did we leave on the table respective to how that process worked?
Yeah.
And it's one of these scenes where I feel like that business owner doesn't quite know sometimes all the questions to start to ask themselves to unpack it. Yeah. They don't know quite how to proctor a conversation with the peers that are around them that influence that decision making. And it's one of these scenes that at the end of the day, they can always kick to tomorrow because it's not a fire that's burning on their front doorstep.
And nobody else in their team, unless they have a bunch of owners, are even thinking about it.
Right.
And in some cases, we have some family businesses that we support that the owners really don't think about it at all because they're getting distributions.
Yeah.
And they're like, we're fine. Just keep doing what you're doing. And like, guys, we're about to age out. At what point does aging out, what does that look like?
Well, I would challenge that. I would say they're thinking about it, but they're not activating against it.
Yeah.
So it is in the back of their mind. It's in the back of their people's mind.
Sit with it.
Yeah. It's in their back of their customers' mind. If I'm 80 years old and I'm inside my business, you better darn well believe that somebody in that business, if not on a regular basis, is asking themselves the question, what happens when the old man dies, right? And what does that mean to my position? And me as an individual, if I'm 50 years old and I'm a rock star salesperson, or whatever the case, I look at that as risk, not knowing where that owner is, not knowing what they're going to do, whether they're going to transition it to their son, whether I believe in their son or not, or daughter, not knowing if it's going to sell to some private equity firm and they're not going to see the same value in me that, the owner. All of a sudden, I'm going to start to anchor to the worst possible scenario that I can possibly anchor to, which means
because you're protecting you and your family.
That's right.
Yeah.
And what does that mean? That means I'm starting to line up backup options. I'm looking for alternative solutions. I'm not focused on my job, in some respects. I'm taking some portion of my mental energy and trying to, preserve backstops for me to say what happens when or if, the old man dies. Or in some cases, some of those people try to figure out, how do I buy the old man out? How do I securitize my own position? Can I start to try to negotiate that? And that leads to a lot of energy run around something that can become unwieldy in those types of conversations.
Do you call this, in your mind, is this succession planning? What is it? Is it business strategy with succession planning?
It's aggregate value optimization. And by value, I don't mean to conclude solely on the monetary aspects of a transaction. It's total value that you can transition to the company. So I include, timing and, what am I trying to achieve from a personal life, attributions? Is it something I want to remain engaged, and this is something I'm very passionate about, or is it something that I want to be on the Hawaiian island? So there's that component of it. Then there's all the softer components of, okay, what does this mean to my legacy? What does the brand name mean to myself, my family, my community? What is it? What happens to my people? Do I want to, do I care enough that it's really important to me that we maintain our base of operations here at the spot that I grew the business? What does it mean for them to get extra opportunity? And can I put them in a position to do that? And so you start to unpack all those soft factors, and then you've got to really weight all that. So the big key is not necessarily that I want to achieve it all, because certainly if I could get $1 billion and I have this massive legacy and my brand name exists to, infinity and everything else, those would all be great things to check. Really what it comes down to is the prioritization, optimization of one factor against the other to understand, if I am willing to make a compromise here to achieve X, Y, or Z, then, I can start to understand that. And like I said, as a banker, if I can start to map that out, now all of a sudden I can test buyer sets against that to say, okay, from the types of buyers, which ones are applicable to that, and specifically individual buyer to individual buyer, as we have time to approach those individuals, can I take a litmus test as to how good of a fit they are related to these level of priorities that I'm otherwise looking at to optimize for that value.
Who's ready to lead when one of your top executives moves on or retires? If succession planning feels overwhelming, you're not alone. Many companies are left scrambling when key leaders leave unexpectedly. At Centennial, we bring over 50 years of executive placement expertise to help you confidently and confidentially navigate the topic and actions of succession. Don't wait for a crisis. Start building your succession strategy today at centennialinc.com. Are there, when you go into a business, are there certain metrics or functions that you find yourself coming back to those clients saying, here are the 5 things we're going to measure the next 12 months?
Yeah.
And it's going to, and I'm assuming sometimes those look a little different than what's on their initial scorecard.
Yeah.
So what are those 5 or 3 things or 7 things that you say, like, we also need to measure these things on your scorecard?
Yeah. I mean, and again, I'm not trying to be coy on this. It really is business to business, industry to industry, objective to objective.
Okay.
So looking, again, starting with that why, starting with the end in mind, I may come to you, you in the same industry as somebody else with a different set of, let's say, KPIs that you should be optimizing for and prioritizing to achieve your outcomes as compared to one of your peers.
Okay.
Now, there's always the general stuff, which is, okay, can I show sustainable growth? Can I show retention of key clients? Can I show a customer acquisition cycle that has upward momentum and that is fruitful? Can I show defensible position of my product? Can I show that I know how to scale? All these types of things otherwise filter in to the business, and they're all factors that otherwise have to get taken into account in any scenario. But the question is that I could draw a list of 100 different items for you today that if 100% optimized for, you're going to be more valuable.
Yeah.
The question really for an individual business owner is, which ones am I going to prioritize?
Yeah.
Ahead of others.
Yeah.
So I'm going to look at where I'm at related to those items, and then I've got to proctor a solution to sit there and say, I can't focus on 100 KPIs. I need to focus on 3, or I need to focus on 5. And maybe that changes next quarter or next year, but these are the 3 I'm really working on right now because I've got to achieve these objectives. I've got to focus.
Are there usually obvious topics that you're going to go and unearth quickly because you just know that an entrepreneur-ran organization or a third-generation family business has these kinds of challenges? Are there struggles that you're like, maybe they don't see it, the business, and are there any you're surprised by?
Yeah.
How can these owners not see this gap?
Yeah. I mean, I think it starts with the process. Back to the stakeholder alignment. That start of the process is such a big key. One thing that I would say is almost unanimous across businesses, private business owners, is that too often they play their transactional decision-making very, very close to their vest. Yeah. They don't talk openly about it. We've had clients that haven't told their wives that they were selling the business till weeks before the transaction happened, which scared the devil out of me because I was like, oh my God, what happens if your wife doesn't like you at home? Right. Like what if your wife, doesn't want you to sell the business? But, I think the natural inclination is because of all these fear, because of, I'm not sure how people are going to react, I'm going to keep this very close to my decision-making. And they almost wear it as a badge of pride because they sit there and say, I'm not private equity. I'm not going to be up for transactions, and I think there's a middle ground that can be met here because, from not that private equity is the perfect, model to emulate, but we can argue that good private equity firms drive a lot of value in the market. And so, but from the day that they buy that business, they're starting to think about how they're transitioning the business, and they're starting to communicate more openly with those key stakeholders.
That's what private equity's doing.
That's
when
right.
They buy a company, they open up a little bit more in transparency.
They are for sale, just being blunt, they are for sale any day of the week.
Yeah.
So effectively, their job is to buy and grow and sell companies within a certain period of time.
Yeah.
And so effectively they're for sale. Now chances that they're going to transition right after they buy something. They haven't added the value optimization to sit there and understand that. But if somebody came along with the right offer, they're for sale any day of the week. And I think there's an opportunity for the private business owner to kind of flip that script, respective to playing their cards very close to the vest. If they start asking themselves a question of like, if I picked my top tier of stakeholders, what would be all the reasons why I'd be scared or they would not engage with, or it'd be bad for my business to communicate openly with what I desire out of a prospective transition in my business. What I find is these private business owners oftentimes want the best for those people. They want the best 100%. For their business. So they don't want to, I've never had a business owner come in and say, you know what, I want to burn the thing down, and most of the time they're sitting there saying, I want my key people taken care of. I want, I want my legacy taken care of. I want my customers taken care of. I want, and these are all the reasons why, frankly, sometimes I don't engage. If I started getting open with those individuals that these are the things that I'm trying to achieve, and to do so, I need to involve you in this process. And I want to, not that you're ultimately going to have the decision-making that's going to reside in my book, but at the end of the day, I need to bring you under the tent because a buyer is going to be looking at you as a part of this transaction potentially. Yeah. And if you could start to open up those conversations, and if you could start to open up conversations with prospective buyers, and you could start to open up the aperture it gives you an opportunity to get a lot of feedback, like, hey, am I properly positioned for what I want to achieve? And what are the impediments to doing so, from the market? And it allows you to start to bring the people under that are actively engaged in the business under the tent to help you row the boat alongside of you, rather than them being on the outside looking in, wondering what's going to happen to me.
And undue friction that exists because of that. Are there certain things where you see business owners just wasting energy? Is there certain categories of, like, if I could just get leaders to stop doing this, that would be so helpful to raise up a water level and start thinking more strategically?
It's more about not what they need to stop doing, it's about what they need to start doing.
Okay.
So it's more, the stop doing is stop kicking it tomorrow and thinking that somehow you're going to get a magical offer that is otherwise going to check all your boxes, and you're going to be in this perfect scenario. Like everything in life, a little bit of pre-planning goes a hell of a long way, and a lot of pre-planning can take you even further. So, I think the question is really, how are you going to optimize for your life's work?
And how do you separate? I'm assuming part of the strategy of even owning companies, you have to think about ownership succession, leadership succession, and team succession. So you may walk into a company that you invest in or that you own, and you're like, boy, there's a gap here with the team, because in the next 18 months, 36 months, this team's going to look really different. So how do you back into that ownership, leadership, and team succession? How much time do you spend there, and what do you look for?
Yeah, I mean, so again, starting with the goals in mind, if they're very indexed towards how do I optimize for my team success, we're starting to unpack, okay, what does that team strength look like? So I'm starting to, gather information from the ownership, from the key team members, from the, secondary lieutenants, if you will. And I'm trying to start to understand, how is this going to present to the buyer set that I'm talking to? Are there weaknesses? Are there gaps on the org chart? Are people out of position? Are people in the right position? How does this all work out? And then what I'm trying to do is work with the business owner around really an org chart exercise to help them understand, hey, here's what an outside group is going to otherwise look at, and here's what needs to be true if we're going to achieve your objectives. And then, we're relying on parties like yourself to start to look at that team to sit there and say, okay, knowing that these objectives have to get met, how does a professional on the HR side otherwise help me organize for what I need to achieve? But
do you look at, when I'm looking at an organization, and we have many clients who are sitting here in this space right now, so partly I know part of the answer, but I want to get your perspective on it. So when you look at an org chart and you go, wow, how's this going to work out? They're all in their mid to late 60s. They're not going to work for forever. And I don't see next leader up. Like I've sat recently with 2 different organizations where there was doubt in the ownership's eyes and voices around the table about the next generation. And in both cases, my feedback was the same. Like, well, how did your generation get prepared for this?
That's right.
We were just thrown into the fire because, dad got sick and somebody had to step up, or we kind of all landed here because we had a CFO die in position, a VP of marketing who resigned and went to another company. And that's how the family was promoted. No strategy, no development, no preparation. So the question that they had is around the next generation. And we're sitting here going, well, what are you doing for the next generation? Because we're talking about the next generation is in their mid to late 50s, mid to, late 40s, early 50s. Like, the next generation should be prepared by now, right? How often do you see that when you're walking into organizations?
I mean, there are always gaps on that org chart. There are always items that people are either, getting to an age that they're considering retirement and they're in a key position. And hey, there's always something that you're looking at to sit there and say, okay, this is an area that I'm otherwise going to have to work around. To the degree that the business is over-indexed to, let's say the the more aged, employee staff, key staff members, it gets back to the owner to sit here and say, okay, what are our options in this scenario? Either we can transition to a strategic who's going to have a bevy of bandwidth already existing within their business that they potentially can apply to your business over a transition period. So they're going to help you solve this issue, for you.
Yeah.
But that also means that they might move your headquarters. They were, eliminate your staff here in town, depending upon the business. That might mean, your brand is definitely going away. So you're going to get rolled in and there's those attributes. If those things are important to you, okay, alternatively, I've got to start to put key members in place, and get momentum against this. You're never going to do a complete org chart revamp, right?
Right.
It's not like you're just going to drop it and then you can't do that. And this is why pre-planning is really important. You can't do this in 6 months.
Right.
You can't do this in a year.
Yeah.
But if I'm given 3, 4, 5 years and I can see enough through that windshield to sit here and say, okay, here's where I'm going. Well, now I can sit here and say, okay, if I'm going to make strategic decisions on hiring to shore up my org chart with the purpose of creating this longer term legacy, where would be the first person that I would add to the team?
Yeah.
Bob is planning on retiring. I'm going to go have a candid conversation with him, get his timeline, start to hire his backup, and I'm going to create a pathway for training behind that specific role. I'm going to get focused on that. And what we find is that, any transaction is eating an elephant. Org chart changes the same way.
Yeah.
It is a big, laborious task. But if you can start to bite it off in pieces and you can start to spoon feed it and you get momentum against it, you can build real power over time.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to be clear with a few elements when I ask the question too, because I know what our audience might be thinking. I'm not advocating for at a certain age people exit. But what I am advocating for is we need to always be prepping next person up. Right. I was just recently in a conversation with a friend of mine who was told that over the next 18 to 20 months, we're going to be, your role is going to exit out of the organization. We want to do it gracefully, but we're telling you in advance. And we can already see that you've been preparing your team to take on that next leadership. So great job to this leader who's very intentional, who's always looking at how do I develop my team versus how do I isolate my team so I'm the only one in control. The other thing I've seen recently is I had a friend who was a CFO of an organization, and he did such a good job developing his accounting and finance department that they said, we have a question. We think you could step out of the CFO role today and your next person up could take your job. Would you be interested in taking over a CFO role for a new thing that we're looking to create? It's this thing called a family office. We'd like for you to become that role because look at what you just did. And then from the family office perspective, help us look at the rest of the organizations that we own and develop that succession. So it's all about developing the next leader to step in. And some organizations, they don't need you to make the transition for them, right? A new buyer, a new owner, they may not want you to make the transition because they're going to make the decisions. But if you come in and see bench strength that are like, this isn't isolated to one leader who's been here for 37 years or 45 years. This is like a whole team of people who could lead in any other respective organization. They'd be the head of sales. They'd be we'd have 3 CFOs here. That is incredible bench strength. So
I think you bring up a good point. It's not always about age. Age is just a logical one that you can potentially see and predict that because a person of a certain age, you can draw assumptions around it. In our business, we talk a lot about the get hit by the bus scenario.
Yes. That's the biggest
concern.
What
happens if this person gets hit by a bus, right? And so any transaction, no matter what, any buyer is going to be assessing relative risk to maintaining the existing business volume and continuation on the growth of what it is that they're buying. So that's what they're assessing, right? They're trying to understand how predictable is it that I'm going to remain on the path that I'm on or that I can accelerate it in the coming years. And that's how they weight value.
Right.
And so to the degree that they perceive that you're single threaded in a certain area where somebody is so key to the business that if that person gets hit by the bus, or just ages out, or, any variety of things that might result in a transition of that role, if they see that it's so single threaded on that, oftentimes they perceive that as risk, which starts showing up in valuation. It shows up in terms. So you're going to see more contingent compensation attached to outcomes or delayed payment. And there's going to be all sorts of things that they would otherwise do to try to mitigate the relative risk that has been presented as you having single thread.
Okay. So that's how the investors evaluate the risk. They put in those extra layers into the contract to keep it together.
That's right.
So if we're going to lose these two people, I always look at I tell many leaders when we do succession for CEOs, like when you sit around a boardroom and you're talking about succession for a CEO, they might be zoned into the succession for the CEO.
Yeah.
We have to remind them, just so you're aware, this org chart today has been in place for quite a while.
Yep.
You adjust the succession and put a new CEO in, there's a high likelihood there's other people on this org chart that are going to say, well, I was working here because of Brent.
Yep.
So if Mike takes over Brent's role,
is he the same leader?
I'll probably exit at the same time or within 18 months. Right. So this is another dynamic of just next leader up. And we should be looking at this all over the organization.
Yeah.
Not just in the C-suite, but you should be looking at what are we doing to develop supervisors into managers, managers into directors, directors into VPs. How are we developing cross-training? I've seen great organization strategy around, we want to build well-rounded business leaders here.
Yeah.
So therefore, we want our team members to work cross-functionally, maybe even takes cross-functional roles that don't exist in other organizations because we want well-rounded business leaders here. All that does is boost value and it boosts confidence and engagement. Because as you're investing in others, they're showing up a lot differently. Because unfortunately, a lot of organizations just don't do that enough, right?
Well, and there's a part of me that says, okay, a really great leader is going to motivate people to work for them in a unique and dynamic way. Mm-hmm. Truly great leaders are establish an organization with a culture that extends beyond them as an individual. Yeah. So if I've really built an incredible organization, it's people are working, they're saying that I don't work here because of Brent. Now Brent helps set the standard for what we are, but I'm working here for this greater cause of what we're doing as an organization. Yeah. And I'm very, very motivated by that as an organization. Now that can be disrupted by adding a bad leader in who doesn't carry the same set of values and wants to doesn't change that. And that violates a fundamental, modus of value, if you will. But I think that should be the aspiration, which is how am I gravitating my people to a common cause beyond the let's say the dynamics that I could potentially bring to the business as a leader.
Yeah. So think about that as a part of your role as a leader.
Yeah. Make it about the organization. How do I develop
about the organization, about where we're going, how we're going to get there, why we're trying to do what we do. Because you've been on this journey with me with Talent Magnet Institute for the last 8+ years.
But think about it from a value perspective. If people are doing business with you because of a certain individual, then all the values tied to that human. Right. And the translatable, can I find another human like that is a unicorn or it carries the same type of resonance, right?
Yeah.
Then there's the really valuable businesses that people are doing business with that business because of the business service, because the business is giving them something of immense value. Now, there's a bunch of people around that make that happen, but at the end of the day, I'm not buying the people. My loyalty resides with the organization. That business is much more valuable to an outsider, almost unanimously than if it's a single human that is making
and I think that's a great challenge to all of us to be answering that question, right? I have said during this journey, it's all about why we're trying to do what we're trying to do and the impact we want to make. Yeah. Like the impact we want to make on the world. The way we deliver it may adjust over time because humans adjust over time, companies adjust over time, market dynamics adjust over time.
It's in the life cycle of the business.
That's right.
So, an entrepreneur, a true entrepreneur, usually is a tour de force. They understand a market niche. They understand a particular industry in a unique and dynamic way, and they can communicate it better than everybody else. And initially, they're selling them, effectively what they're bringing to the table, and maybe some light organization behind it to an outcome, right? Yeah. That's how they start the business.
Yeah.
The question is how many of those transition to, it's not about me, what I'm selling to this individual or me being the resident expert on this. It's about the organization that I've otherwise memorialized to carry on the methodologies that I thought were so important in the market. Right. And can they leap from that true entrepreneur to an establishment of a true organization that extends beyond the individual that otherwise started or led that business?
Yeah, and it's very different building an entrepreneur-led, personality-led brand than trying to establish an organization.
Right.
It takes a very different skill set, right? Like I've said, we're not trying to build a consultancy.
Yeah.
We're trying to build a movement around making learning and development pervasive and to make it easier for organizations, right? For an organization to say, I don't even know how we would tackle this thing. For us to say, you don't need to know how you're going to tackle it. You just need to describe to us and let us get in the details of what you're trying to accomplish. Hiring an executive shouldn't feel like taking a gamble. When you need a leader who will actually move the needle, the stakes are far too high for guesswork. Centennial has placed successful executives for over 50 years with a 98% client referral rate and decades of deep client relationships. We know how to find leaders who deliver results. Our proven 4C recruiting process connects you with the candidates who bring the character, culture, chemistry, and competence to drive your vision forward. Let's find your next game changer. Visit centennialinc.com to start the conversation. We will design it, we'll develop it, design it, programmatic, build it out, and we'll deploy it for perpetuity. Right? We have a client we were talking about yesterday. They've worked with us for the last 6 years. Every year, it's the question. It's actually, they don't come to us with the statement of work. They come to us with, here's our budget. What are we going to do this year? What are we going to do this year? You know what we're doing. You know how we're growing. You know our people. So we're an extension of that team, right? That we're just a part of their strategy that's helping them grow and develop. And it's not, they're not coming to us for one thing. They're coming to us for, be a part of our vision. Here's what we're trying to achieve. Help us be the learning, development, and talent and leadership department, basically.
I love that.
And they have an HR department, right? So we're just an extension of what they do. It's been the learning of being in a boutique search firm for the last 26 years is that's the boutique search firm's niche.
Got it.
Our goal is to find leaders who understand the value and who say, and this is another key, most of the time the projects we're working on are completely confidential and the family or the business owners want it to remain that way until a point. Whether that's confidential to the market or confidential to the team. And they turn to a boutique search firm to execute in that manner, right? So we just picked up a new search up in the Northeast on Friday, and this family has a new non-family CEO, and he brought us along for the ride of here's what I'm going to be trying to do the next 5 to 7 years for this family.
Got it.
And there's going to be a lot of additions and subtractions because of where we're going. People that got us here may not get us there. And there may be people who, if we just develop them, could be helpful to the overall mission of the organization. So I need TMI involved and I need Centennial involved to help us with this lift. And that's the boutiqueness. That's we want to lock in on those organizations. We have a strategy. We know talent, leadership, and development of humans is critically important. Help us figure out this strategy. So it's hard to describe in an industry that's very functionally driven. We don't think functionally driven. We think leadership strategy driven. And that's what birthed what we're doing today. And you saw it, and a lot of other board of advisors saw it, and a lot of other friends saw it, and a lot of other clients saw it, that if you do this, we're in. Because you're locking in on growth of organizations takes human focus. and the right capital to support the growth of the organization.
Amen.
So those two things coming together are what we're on this continual mission for, right? Where does legacy? So you talked a little bit about the island. Is my legacy that I want? I love that you mentioned the community component, because to a lot of family and private businesses, their impact on their community, whatever geography or attributes that community is defined as, it's really important to them. Their employees, their team members, the multi-generational families that they've supported and employed over the years, and then how they're thought of, how the business is thought of. What's the family name what's the family name thought about over the next 20 years after we're gone?
Yeah.
But tell me more a little bit about legacy. Like, how much time do you get in there and you find out that, like, ooh, this person doesn't know what legacy they want?
Yeah.
Right? They're just grinding so hard to beat last year's numbers. So what are you doing to help people really think about their legacy and long-term impact?
I think it's a really good question. I think more often than not, to your point, they're so heads down and they don't really know the questions to ask themselves. Mm-hmm. They haven't really sat down and tried to really put on paper what this means to me, right? Yeah. And because they haven't done it for themselves, they're certainly not having the conversation with their business partners. They're not having the conversation with the key members around themselves to understand and reflect on what does this mean to other people, right? And how do I take that into account on my decision-making? Mm. So again, it's back to the theme where they kick that conversation tomorrow. Maybe they're picking up on it in a loose way, over a lunch with a key member or whatever the case, but they really haven't memorialized it and started to sit there and put something down. And so because they haven't started there, anytime I start with something, I may get it on paper. It's probably 50% good, maybe, on a good day. But if I can get it on paper and I get 50% good and I can go back and revisit it, it starts to sharpen from there, right? Yeah. And so, but if you don't take that first step related to what their legacy means to them, or this is how I define it, now I don't start having open conversations around it, you really never get that sharpening exercise to start to come to a conclusion like, here's where I'm gravitating towards. And that is why we really engineer this whole stakeholder alignment exercise. Is, part of it's the report that we give out, which tells where there's points of alignment and misalignment and all these types of things. The great majority of the value, over half the value, is them sitting in a room and starting to unpack, what did you mean by this? Well, when I said this, I was thinking that, and here's why this is important to me. And this is what my dad said with me when, he had me build the business, and, start to understand each other at a different level. And people either start to sit up and say, you know what, I really like Mike's answer. I think that resonates with me more than what I put down. Or, hey, I'm thinking about it entirely differently. And how do we square, you being one spot and me being another spot, and at least recognizing that there's that level of misalignment that at some point in the future, we may need to figure out a median scenario that meets both of our needs, if you will. And so I think that's the type of discussion where there's just so much value in having that discussion in a proctored way. Potentially the Gearing Center or some of these other, transitional planning groups can help people strategically think through it. But we've really tried to memorialize it in a process that is low barrier to entry. It doesn't cost a lot of time, but it really starts the evolution of this discussion for somebody to really start to define for themselves and chew on what does legacy truly mean to me, or what do I want to be remembered for in building this business?
Yeah. And it doesn't mean you're going to, God forbid, you're not going to pass tomorrow.
No.
But something could happen.
Right.
And what is your legacy? Because it may also, if we all take a step back, how am I showing up today?
Yeah.
How did I show up last year that I want to adjust for this year? What do I want to be different for myself, my family, and my team over the next 12 to 18 months?
Right.
So few people ask those questions.
That's right.
You hear about these exercises of the tombstone, of the, God forbid somebody will have to read a eulogy at your funeral.
Sure.
There's a reason to do those exercises.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And when you have to be the one who reads a eulogy on someone else's behalf, it makes you reflect on, I wonder what they would say about me.
What was the root of this, right?
And if it is, we all have such an opportunity to create impact. You know, there's so many emotional stories that I get to hear from leaders who have been impacted by the CEOs and hiring managers that they report to, because these individuals really invested in me. They asked the next questions. They cared about the way they showed up that would help me show up at my best.
Yeah.
Right. So can you think about, as an owner, as a leader, how am I showing up that's helping my team show up at their best?
That's right.
How am I showing up every day that's helping my family show up at their best? Because ultimately, that's part of our responsibility as leaders. We should be doing that. And I hope there's someone listening who goes, all right, I've heard it 3, 4, 5 times. I've not done it. I'm going to sit down and do it. I'm going to think about my legacy. If Brent and Mike were to write a eulogy about me, if mom and dad were to write a eulogy about me, if my spouse or my partner or my children were to write a eulogy about me, or those long-term employees who have been working for me for 22, 27, 37 years, what would they say where I put value, where I put time, where I put energy, and what kind of impact did I have on others? Is a great place to start with this exercise.
And I think it's twofold on that reflection. You should start to think about what questions and define for yourself, what does that look like? But if you're not if there's no feedback loop from the other people around you and those different tiers of stakeholders, you know, even though a spouse might not be involved in a business, I would argue a spouse is a really important part of what they gave up to help you build the business in the first place, or whatever the case. And they should have a voice at that table. You should understand, you know, kind of what does it mean to them, you know, in selling this business? You know, what are their motivations? So there's all these factors. You have to create that feedback loop, and you have to start that conversation with people on a structured, multi-tiered way, you know, if you're going to get the most fruit out of that effort. Now, I think any planning is great, and mortality being the dramatic conclusion, if you will, but the less dramatic conclusion is by choice. And usually it's a diagnosis. It's I'm overworked and overwhelmed. I, get an unsolicited offer that creates the precipice for a prospective transaction. But usually those scenarios come, in an unplanned way if you haven't otherwise started laying this root over time.
Yeah. So Brent, one of the things I heard, 12, 15 years ago was a speech at LeaderCast, and it was by Kat Cole, and her comment she made from stage was, as a business owner, as an entrepreneur, as a CEO, if the best CEO in the world, you were able to hire the best CEO in the world who could help you elevate your business, you were able to hire them, what would they do different the first day, the first week, the first month if they sat in your seat? Right. And you have the perspective of being a business owner of many organizations, working with many CEOs, having successful exits, having things that didn't turn out as planned, to sit in and evaluate that seat as CEO. Are there themes or other trends that you see when you come in? If you were to sit in the seat of Mike Sipple, and are there like, oh, I know, here's where I would go to look for things and ask these kinds of questions? Because it's like, it's what everybody's missing. And I know we've talked a lot about this in a roundabout way and a direct way, but what else should I be thinking about, basically, is the big question. What else should I be thinking about as an owner and a CEO that you would see and observe that I may never see myself, because I either don't have the experience, the exposure, or the expertise?
Yeah. I mean, again, it's not common across businesses. We just see so many different problem statements within these organizations. I mean, and obviously we look at it very much through a transactional mindset, because that's how our clients are engaging with us, right? That's what we're here for. At the end of the day, though, it really comes down to they really need to be organizing ahead of time, like we've already talked about. But the other thing is who's got a primary function, a primary responsibility in thinking through this and organizing for it on behalf of the organization. Is it somebody on the board? Is it the CFO who's really looking for the value optimization components of this and starting to plan for it? Is it the CEO that's going to be organizing it? Somebody should have a role that is dedicated, that I'm allocating a certain amount of my time to understanding this objective and planning for it and understanding how that strategically aligns to my budget for this year or my budget for the next couple of years to achieve that.
And it kind of ties into the thought that the best time to work on succession and long-term planning was last year.
That's right.
And the second best time to work on succession and long-term planning is now.
Yeah, without a doubt.
Right.
And any time given is going to yield a result.
Anytime.
I mean, look, if you come to me and you say, hey, look, I got a half year to position, that's better than if you come to me at the time. You're never going to lose. I mean, shoot, we had a project who came to us and said, we have to sell the business. And we recognized on the front end that the business wasn't well positioned. And we talked to them about it, but they said, I'm frustrated. I got to get out. We ran the process and yielded a result. And through the process, they started to recognize the deficiencies in what we were telling them were at the table. And we said, look, at the end of the day, we put a lot of effort into this, but you're 12 months off from fixing some of these major problems. Like you could really fix this, and we could
just slow down and
we could bring it back to the market. And and they turned what was effectively, they without getting into the numbers because I don't want to, get in that detail. They over doubled the value of the project in 12 months, and they increased their cash at closing by, almost 3x.
Wow.
So the original deal, they were going to take a much more substantive portion in contingency, and it was, half the value that they ultimately received a year later, just on some general basic blocking and tackling stuff that, hey, we've got to get some data around this. I need to pull together, an ERP system. Hey, you've got one key person that we've got to get into the fold here and lock up because it's going to be important to a transaction. All stuff that was very predictable. And it was just from a straight valuation perspective, it was hugely impactful. And that's a year. You get 3, 4, 5 years, imagine what you can do.
Yeah. Well, it also, like a sale-ready business is just a well-run organization.
Yeah.
Right? That a leader has a strategy. An organization is thinking long-term.
Yep.
Always think long-term is the kind of the call to action that I hear. It's like you need to be spending time thinking about the long-term.
Yeah.
Solving for the problems that aren't coming up today but could be addressed or will come up in the future. So you're thinking contingency. You're planning for the contingencies in advance versus the evaluation of a outside buyer or a successor or even a management team that's looking at the risk profile of your company. Fix the things they're going to identify as risk.
Yeah.
That's all we're part of the big suggestion here.
And I think all of those scenes are always going to yield better results. Mm-hmm. But what I'd also encourage you is you should be thinking it through an additional lens, which is, okay, again, with that end in mind, I can have a really well-run business that may not align to 100% of the goals that I otherwise want to achieve. Mm-hmm. So if I don't think through what that outcome looks like on the back end, and I'm not comparing my current state to the desired state of where I want to be to understanding the achievement of that, I can have a really well-run business that does great things and can yield a great valuation, but doesn't achieve several of these soft factors because I haven't put pieces in place around, the org chart or around, the sustainability of my sales pipeline or whatever that ends up being. Yeah. There's multiple things it could end up being, but it's just, if you got to look at it through that other lens and get that feedback loop to sit there and say, okay, if this is my desire, what does it look like for me to align to that, through being well run.
Yeah. So Brent, one last question to wrap this up. What does unconventional leadership mean to you?
Oh man. Look, we've talked about a lot of it. I think the leaders who are super dynamic in thinking through this and focused on it, they're unconventional in their own way. Like, I think it's the exception around the rule, and it's fascinating to me when you've got somebody who's really leans into it or is proctoring their own solution and doing an exceptional job at it. And so, the ones that are doing that, that I get super excited about are the ones that are looking at what this can do for the aggregate good of the people that I built around the business, and put them in a position to really win in the next evolution of what that company does. And those outcomes are so powerful. I mean, it's really exciting to me to see an organization and a leader who has otherwise built an organization that their people are growing in the bigger organization that they're getting acquired by, or they're getting immense opportunity as a result of them building an exceptional business. We've got a close friend who, a lot of his management team got promotions into a huge organization because he had built
promotions. Yeah.
Amazing organization at his level and put his people in a position to win. And to me, that is incredible.
Yeah. That's awesome. Yeah. Brent, thank you for being here today.
Yeah.
I really appreciate the discussion. I know our audience does as well. I want to thank all of you for joining us for this episode. I want to thank the Cincinnati Podcast Studio for their amazing leadership and design and creativity of bringing the content to you as well. And we look forward to the next conversation.
Thank you for having me.